What would you do if someone walked into your home, called the cops on you, and claimed it was theirs? That's exactly what happened to me at my peaceful cabin retreat last summer. Owning a cabin in the Blue Ridge Mountains had been a lifelong dream of mine. It wasn't just a house, it was my sanctuary, a place where the chaos of the world melted away into the serenity of nature. The cabin, nestled among towering pines with a crystal-clear lake nearby, was the reward for years of hard work, late nights, and sacrifices. That summer, I desperately needed a break. After weeks of juggling work and responsibilities, I packed up my car and headed to Blue Ridge Retreat, my beloved hideaway near Asheville, North Carolina. As I drove up the winding mountain roads, I could feel my stress melting away. The thought of lazy afternoons on the porch, with nothing but birdsong and the rustling leaves to accompany me, brought a smile to my face. But my peace was shattered the moment I pulled into the gravel driveway. Something was off. A sleek black SUV was parked directly in front of the cabin. At first, I thought it might belong to a hiker or a lost traveler. After all, the area was known for its trails and scenic beauty. But as I got closer, I realized something was wrong. I stepped out of my car and immediately heard muffled voices coming from inside the cabin. My cabin. My stomach sank. I froze for a moment, torn between confusion and anger. Who would be in my house without my permission? Could it be burglars? Lost hikers? The possibilities raced through my mind. Taking a deep breath, I cautiously approached the front door. The familiar creak of the wooden porch steps felt unsettling this time. My heart pounded as I reached for the doorknob. To my surprise, it wasn't locked. With a quick twist, I pushed the door open and stepped inside. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling slightly. "Is someone in here?" The voices stopped abruptly. A moment of tense silence hung in the air before a sharp, commanding voice rang out from the kitchen. "Who's there? This is private property." I blinked, stunned. A middle-aged woman with a sharp blonde bob haircut emerged from the kitchen, her hands on her hips and her eyes narrowing as she looked me up and down. "Excuse me?" I stammered. "This is my cabin." Her lips curled into a sneer. "No, it's not. I bought this place fair and square last week. Now get out before I call the police for trespassing." In that moment, my peaceful retreat turned into a brewing storm of chaos. What could I do? This was my property. I had all the paperwork to prove it. But the way she stared at me, with unwavering confidence and a hint of malice, made me realize one thing: this wasn't going to be resolved easily. And little did I know, this was only the beginning. I stood there, stunned, staring at the woman in my kitchen who was now staring daggers back at me. Her tone was sharp, her posture defiant, and her sheer audacity left me momentarily speechless. The nerve of her, to stand in my cabin, claim it as her own, and demand that I leave. Before I could find the words to respond, she took a step closer, arms crossed, and raised her voice. "Well? What are you doing here? I already told you, this is my house. I bought it just last week. Now get out before I call the cops." It was surreal. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Did she actually think she could intimidate me into leaving? For a moment, I wondered if this was some sort of elaborate prank. But the fire in her eyes and the way she squared her shoulders said otherwise. She was serious. Dead serious. I cleared my throat, forcing myself to remain calm. "Ma'am," I began, trying to keep my voice steady, "there's clearly been a mistake. This is my cabin. I've owned it for over 5 years. I have all the paperwork to prove it." Her sneer deepened. "Oh, don't give me that. I know what I bought. Do you think I'm stupid? My name is Karen Thompson, and this is my vacation home." Ah, Karen. Somehow, the name fit her perfectly. Before I could respond, another figure emerged from the back of the cabin. A man, slightly hunched, with thinning hair and glasses, stepped hesitantly into view. He looked uncomfortable, as if he'd rather be anywhere else but here. Karen? What's going on?" he asked, his voice quiet and tentative. "This man," Karen spat, jabbing a finger in my direction, "broke into our new vacation home. He's a trespasser, Harold. Call the police." The man, who I now knew as Harold, looked at me with visible unease. His eyes darted between Karen and me, and for a moment, it seemed like he might protest. Are you sure, dear? Maybe we should hear him out." Karen whirled around to face him, her expression a mix of frustration and disdain. "Don't be ridiculous, Harold. Do I have to do everything myself? Call the cops, now." I raised my hands in a placating gesture. "Please, let's not escalate this. There's clearly been a misunderstanding. I have the deed, mortgage records, everything. Let me show you, and we can sort this out peacefully." Karen didn't even let me finish. "I don't need to see your fake documents," she snapped. "This is my house, and you need to leave. Now." She stepped closer, actually trying to shove me toward the door. Her hands pushed against my chest, and my patience, already worn thin, evaporated. I held my ground, my voice firm but measured. "Ma'am, I don't know what you think is going on here, but this is my property, and I'm not going anywhere. If anyone is trespassing, it's you." Her face turned an alarming shade of red, and she let out an indignant shriek. "How dare you? Harold, call the police. Tell them there's an unstable man here threatening us." Harold hesitated, his phone in hand, clearly conflicted. Karen, maybe we should." "Do it, Harold," she barked. I sighed heavily, realizing there was no reasoning with her. "Fine," I said, my tone clipped. "Call the police. In fact, I welcome it. Let's have them verify who the real owner is." Karen's expression shifted, a glint of triumph flashing in her eyes. "Ha! You'll regret this. The cops are going to haul you away in handcuffs." As Harold reluctantly dialed 911, I sat down in my armchair, pulling out my phone. If this was going to escalate to law enforcement, I wanted to be ready. I logged into my bank account to retrieve mortgage payment records and texted my realtor to email me a copy of the deed, just in case. Karen paced around the living room like a predator stalking its prey. She alternated between glaring at me and shouting instructions at Harold, who was now explaining the situation to the dispatcher with clear discomfort. I ignored her ranting, focusing on gathering my evidence. 15 minutes later, the crunch of tires on gravel announced the arrival of the police. Karen's face lit up with vindictive glee. "Finally," she exclaimed, throwing her arms in the air. "Now you're going to get what's coming to you." I stayed seated, my expression calm, as two sheriff's deputies stepped inside. Karen wasted no time launching into her tirade. "Officers! Thank goodness you're here. This man broke into our new vacation home and is refusing to leave. Arrest him immediately." The deputies exchanged a glance before turning to me. "Sir, can you explain what's going on here?" I stood and addressed them directly, keeping my voice steady. "Of course, officers. My name is Michael Brooks, and I am the legal owner of this cabin. I arrived earlier today to find these people here, claiming it's theirs. I can show you documentation proving my ownership." The deputies nodded. "We'll need to see that." "Ma'am," one of them said, turning to Karen, "do you have any proof of ownership?" Karen faltered for the first time, her confidence wavering. "Well, I must have left it at home, but I know I bought this place. The seller said it would be vacant and ready for us." "And who was the seller?" the deputy asked. Karen hesitated. I don't remember his name. The deputy's expression grew skeptical. Ma'am, this sounds like it might be a case of rental fraud. Scammers often create fake listings of real properties. Did you complete an actual sale or just pay a deposit for a rental? Karen's face flushed with indignation. No. That's not possible. I know what I paid for. I interjected calmly. Officers, I have records of my mortgage payments and emails from my realtor. Would you like to see them? The deputies reviewed my documents and quickly verified their authenticity. One of them turned to Karen. Ma'am, this cabin is indeed legally owned by Mr. Brooks. It appears you may have fallen for a scam. Karen's jaw dropped. But that can't be right. I paid good money for this place. How much did you pay? The deputy asked. $500 for the week, she mumbled. The deputy raised an eyebrow. And you thought that was enough to buy an entire cabin? Karen's face crumpled as the reality began to sink in. Harold, looking thoroughly embarrassed, muttered, I told you it seemed too good to be true. But Karen wasn't ready to concede defeat. As she was escorted out, she turned back to me with a venomous glare. You haven't heard the last of me, she hissed. Little did I know, she wasn't bluffing. This was just the beginning. The tension in the room was palpable as I sat in my armchair, waiting for the police to arrive. Karen continued pacing the living room like a caged tiger, throwing occasional venomous glares my way. Harold, meanwhile, fidgeted in the corner, looking as though he wished the floor would swallow him whole. Every now and then, Karen barked an instruction at him, her tone dripping with irritation. Make sure you tell the police exactly what happened, Harold, she snapped. This trespasser broke into our house and is threatening us. Harold mumbled something unintelligible, his phone still pressed to his ear. I could hear him describing the situation to the dispatcher, but his voice lacked conviction. It was clear that even he wasn't buying Karen's story. I stayed silent, focusing on my phone. By now, I'd compiled a wealth of evidence, my mortgage payment history, emails from my realtor, and photos of the deed that had just come through. Despite my outward calm, anger simmered beneath the surface. How dare she not only invade my property but also twist the truth so shamelessly? But I knew better than to let my emotions get the best of me. The facts were on my side, and I trusted that they would prevail. After what felt like an eternity, the sound of crunching gravel outside announced the arrival of the sheriff's deputies. Karen's face lit up with malicious triumph. Finally, she exclaimed, throwing her hands up in the air. Now we'll see this squatter dragged out of our home in handcuffs. I simply leaned back in my chair, arms crossed, and waited. Moments later, two deputies stepped inside, their expressions calm but authoritative. The first deputy, a tall man with a no-nonsense demeanor, introduced himself as Deputy Mark Harris, while the second, Deputy Rachel Collins, hung back to assess the situation. Karen wasted no time launching into her performance. She gestured wildly at me, her voice trembling with faux indignation. Officers, thank goodness you're here. This man broke into our vacation home and refuses to leave. He's dangerous. You need to arrest him immediately. Deputy Harris raised a hand to stop her tirade. Ma'am, please calm down. We need to hear both sides of the story before taking any action. He turned to me. Sir, can you tell us what's going on? I stood up and introduced myself, my voice steady and confident. My name is Michael Brooks. I've owned this cabin for over 5 years. I arrived today to find these people inside, claiming it's theirs. I have documentation proving my ownership, which I'm happy to show you. Deputy Harris nodded. We'll need to see that. Ma'am, he said, turning back to Karen, do you have any proof of ownership? Karen faltered, her earlier bravado wavering for the first time. Well, I must have left it at home, she stammered. But I know I bought this place. The seller said it would be vacant and ready for us. Deputy Collins stepped forward, her brow furrowed. And who was the seller, ma'am? Karen hesitated. I don't remember his name. It was an online listing. The deputies exchanged a glance, their skepticism evident. Ma'am, this sounds like it might be a case of rental fraud, Deputy Collins explained. It's not uncommon for scammers to steal photos of real properties and create fake listings. Did you complete a full real estate transaction and receive a deed, or did you just pay a deposit for a rental? Karen's face turned red as she spluttered, no. I mean, it was supposed to be a sale. We paid $500 to secure it. Deputy Harris raised an eyebrow. You paid $500 for an entire vacation home, ma'am? Karen opened her mouth to protest, but the words seemed to die on her lips. Harold, who had remained silent until now, finally spoke up, his voice barely above a whisper. Karen, I think we've been scammed. His admission hung in the air like a weight. For a brief moment, Karen looked as though she might break down. But instead of acknowledging the truth, she doubled down, her voice rising to a shrill pitch. No. This is our house. I don't care what kind of scam you're talking about, this man is lying. Arrest him. I interjected calmly, holding up my phone. Officers, I have records of my mortgage payments, emails from my realtor, and a copy of the deed. Would you like to review them? Deputy Harris nodded. Yes, please. He and Deputy Collins carefully examined the documents on my phone, their expressions growing more serious with each passing moment. Finally, Deputy Harris handed the phone back to me and turned to Karen. Ma'am, this cabin is legally owned by Mr. Brooks. The documents are clear, and there's no evidence to support your claim. It appears you've been the victim of a rental scam. Karen's jaw dropped. But that can't be right. We drove 5 hours to get here. What about our vacation? Deputy Collins's tone softened slightly. I understand this is disappointing, ma'am, but you need to vacate the premises immediately. This is private property. Karen's face twisted in fury. This isn't over, she snarled, pointing a finger at me. I'll get my lawyer involved. You haven't heard the last of me. I sighed, feeling both relief and exhaustion as the deputies escorted Karen and Harold out of the cabin. For a moment, I allowed myself to believe it was over. But deep down, I had a sinking feeling that Karen wasn't done with me yet. The calm after Karen and Harold left was short-lived. I spent the next day repairing small damages they had caused during their unauthorized stay. The broken potted plant and scuffed porch were irritating but manageable. By evening, I had begun to relax again, thinking the worst was behind me. I should have known better. As twilight settled over the mountains and the first stars began to dot the sky, the sound of an approaching car broke the peaceful silence. My stomach tightened as the now familiar black SUV pulled into the gravel driveway once again. I stepped out onto the porch, arms crossed, bracing myself for yet another confrontation. Karen emerged from the driver's seat, clutching a thick stack of papers and wearing a smug, triumphant expression. Harold trailed behind her, his hands shoved into his pockets, his face a mask of reluctant shame. I told you this wasn't over. Karen crowed, waving the papers in the air like a trophy. This is my cabin, and now I have proof. You're the one trespassing, and you'll regret not listening to me the first time. I stared at her, incredulous. Karen, what on earth are you talking about? You've already been told this isn't your property. Wrong, she snapped, marching up the steps and thrusting the papers into my face. Look at this. It's a deed with my name on it. Proof that I bought this cabin fair and square. I took the papers, glancing over them, and couldn't help but let out a bitter laugh. The document was an obvious forgery, printed on cheap office paper, riddled with typos, and featuring a grainy clip art version of a legal seal. It was so amateurish that it would have been laughable if the situation weren't so absurd. "This is clearly fake, Karen," I said, my patience wearing thin. "Did you seriously print this out at a copy shop?" Her expression faltered for just a moment before she doubled down, her voice rising in indignation. "It's not fake. The man at Quick Print Center helped me make it look official. I even paid extra for the seal." I blinked, momentarily speechless. "Karen, you're admitting to forging legal documents. That's a felony. Do you even realize how much trouble you're in?" Harold shifted uncomfortably behind her, finally speaking up. "Karen, maybe we should just leave. I don't think this is going to work." "Shut up, Harold," she snapped. "I'm not going anywhere. This is our house, and I'm not letting this crook steal it from us." Before I could react, Karen stormed past me, attempting to shove the door open. I blocked her path, my voice firm. "That's enough, Karen. You need to leave before you make things worse for yourself." Her face twisted with rage. "You can't keep me out. This is my house," she shrieked, lunging at me with clawing hands. I sidestepped her attack, narrowly avoiding a swipe aimed at my face. "Stop it!" I shouted. "You're assaulting me now. Leave, or I'm calling the police again." Instead of backing down, Karen grabbed a potted plant from the porch and hurled it at the front window. The terracotta pot shattered against the glass, leaving a web of cracks. Harold gasped, his hands flying to his head. "Karen, stop. You're making it worse." But Karen was beyond reasoning. Fueled by anger and desperation, she grabbed another object, a decorative lantern, and threw it against the wall, the metallic clang echoing in the quiet night. I retreated inside, slamming the door behind me and immediately dialing 911. "This is Michael Brooks," I said, my voice shaking with anger. "The trespassers from yesterday are back. They're vandalizing my property and tried to assault me. I need officers here immediately." The dispatcher assured me that help was on the way. As I paced by the window, watching Karen scream and pound on the door, Harold tried futilely to calm her down. "Karen, please," he begged. "This has gone too far. We need to stop." "I'm not stopping," she yelled. "That man stole our dream house, and I won't let him win." The tension was unbearable, each minute stretching into what felt like an eternity. Then, finally, the sound of sirens pierced the air, and flashing red and blue lights illuminated the driveway. The same two deputies from the previous day, Deputy Harris and Deputy Collins, stepped out of their patrol car, their expressions grim. "Ma'am, step away from the door and put your hands where we can see them," Deputy Harris ordered. Karen turned to face them, her eyes wide and wild. "Thank God you're here," she exclaimed. "Arrest this man. He's been harassing us and—" "Ma'am," Deputy Collins interrupted, her voice stern, "we've already verified that this property belongs to Mr. Brooks. You're trespassing, and now you're vandalizing private property. You need to stop immediately." "But I have a deed," Karen shouted, thrusting the fake document at them. Deputy Harris took one look at it and shook his head. "Ma'am, this is clearly fraudulent. Did you create this yourself?" Karen's defiance finally cracked, and she stammered, "Well, the copy shop guy helped me." "That's forgery, ma'am," Deputy Collins said grimly. "You're under arrest for trespassing, vandalism, assault, and forging legal documents. Turn around and place your hands behind your back." "No. You can't do this," Karen screamed as the deputies moved to handcuff her. "This is my house. I won't let you take it from me." Harold stood off to the side, his head bowed in shame. As Karen was led to the patrol car, he approached me hesitantly. I'm so sorry," he mumbled. "I tried to stop her. I didn't want any of this to happen. I sighed, exhaustion washing over me. Just, get out of here, Harold. As the patrol car drove away, taking Karen with it, I leaned against the porch railing, my heart still pounding. The peace of my sanctuary had been shattered, and I couldn't shake the feeling that this nightmare wasn't quite over yet. The day of the trial arrived, and with it came a swirl of emotions, anger, anxiety, and an overwhelming need for closure. I dressed carefully, choosing a suit that made me feel composed and confident. As I stepped into the Buncombe County Courthouse, I couldn't help but notice the stark contrast between the polished marble floors and the weight of the conflict we were about to resolve. Karen was already there, sitting stiffly beside her lawyer, Richard Thompson, a sharp-suited man with an air of calculated confidence. Karen, however, looked anything but poised. She shot me a venomous glare as I walked in, her defiance still flickering, but I caught a hint of nervousness in her fidgeting hands. Sitting a few seats away was Henry, her husband, slouched and visibly drained, as if the weight of the past weeks had finally caught up to him. My lawyer, James Carter, met me at the courtroom door, his demeanor calm and reassuring. "We've got this," he said with a confidence that I desperately needed. "The evidence is airtight. Let's focus on presenting your side clearly." The courtroom itself was imposing, with its high ceilings and rows of wooden benches. The judge, a stern-looking woman in her 60s, called the court to order with an authoritative bang of her gavel. "We are here today to determine the rightful ownership of the cabin in question and to address the charges of forgery, trespassing, and vandalism against the defendant, Karen Thompson." The formal tone of the proceedings amplified my tension. This wasn't just about the cabin anymore, it was about justice, about setting things right after Karen had turned my peaceful retreat into a storm of chaos. James began our side of the case, laying out the evidence with precision. He presented the original deed, mortgage records, and tax payments, all meticulously documented to show my uninterrupted ownership of the cabin for the past 5 years. Each piece of evidence was like a brick in a wall, building an unassailable case. As he spoke, I glanced at Karen. She stared straight ahead, her expression stony, but I noticed the corners of her mouth twitch. Was it fear? Regret? Or just the realization that her flimsy story wouldn't hold? James then brought up the incident with the forged deed. "Your Honor," he said firmly, holding up a copy of Karen's fraudulent document, "this is a blatant forgery. The so-called legal seal is nothing more than clip art. It's almost laughable, except for the serious implications." The judge raised an eyebrow and examined the paper. "Ms. Thompson," she asked, her voice sharp, "did you create this document yourself?" Karen's lawyer tried to interject, but she waved him off. "Ms. Thompson?" Karen hesitated, her bravado cracking for the first time. "Well, I wanted it to look official." The courtroom buzzed with murmurs, the weight of her admission sinking in. Henry looked down at his hands, visibly cringing at her words. Then came the twist I hadn't expected. James called Henry to the stand. As he walked up, his shoulders slumped, and his face was a portrait of shame. He was sworn in, and James began questioning him gently but firmly. "Mr. Thompson, can you tell us about the forged deed? Were you involved in its creation?" Henry hesitated, casting a nervous glance at Karen. Her eyes bore into him, but he finally sighed. "Karen," she insisted, "we needed it." She was so determined to prove that the cabin was ours. I knew it wasn't right, but I didn't know how to stop her. His voice cracked, and for the first time, I saw him not as Karen's accomplice but as another victim of her manipulative nature. The courtroom was silent as Henry continued, his words trembling. "She just wanted something to call her own. I think she felt like if we had that cabin, maybe everything in our lives would finally feel perfect." The judge turned to Karen, her voice firm but not unkind. "Ms. Thompson, do you have anything to say for yourself?" Karen stood, visibly shaking. Her defiance had crumbled entirely, replaced by an uncharacteristic vulnerability. I just wanted something that was mine," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Everything else in my life feels like it's falling apart. I thought, if I had the cabin, I'd feel whole." For a brief moment, I felt a pang of something I hadn't expected, sympathy. Her actions had caused me so much stress and anger, but seeing her in this state, I realized her actions were driven by desperation and pain, not pure malice. After reviewing the evidence and hearing the testimony, the judge delivered her decision. The court finds in favor of the plaintiff, Michael Brooks. He is the rightful owner of the cabin, as supported by all legal documentation. Furthermore, Ms. Thompson is guilty of forgery, vandalism, and trespassing. She paused, her gaze heavy as she looked at Karen. "Your actions, Ms. Thompson, were reckless and illegal, but they also reflect a deeper issue. While I cannot excuse your behavior, I hope you take this opportunity to reflect and make amends." Karen was ordered to pay restitution for the damages and cover my legal fees. She was also referred for possible probation on the forgery charges, narrowly avoiding jail time. As the gavel fell, I felt an overwhelming wave of relief. Justice had been served. As the courtroom emptied, I saw Henry approach me hesitantly. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "For everything." I nodded, not quite ready to forgive, but grateful for his honesty. Karen, meanwhile, was led out of the courtroom, her head bowed in defeat. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could finally breathe again. But as I left the courthouse, I couldn't help but reflect on the tangled mess of human emotions behind the chaos. Karen's desperation, Henry's guilt, my own frustration, it all underscored how complex people's motivations can be. This wasn't just a victory for me. It was a lesson in standing firm, even when the odds felt insurmountable. As I drove back to my cabin after the trial, the weight of the past few weeks seemed to lift slightly. The mountains stood steadfast against the setting sun, their timeless beauty a stark contrast to the chaos I had endured. The winding road to Blue Ridge Retreat felt different this time, less of a journey and more of a homecoming. When I finally parked and stepped out of my car, the familiar scent of pine and cool mountain air greeted me. It was as if the cabin itself was welcoming me back. I walked onto the porch, running my fingers over the railings, now repaired after Karen's reckless tantrum. The cracked windowpane had been replaced, and the plants she had destroyed were flourishing once more. My little sanctuary was whole again. Sitting on the porch with a cup of tea, I stared out at the lake shimmering in the moonlight. The last few weeks had been exhausting, emotionally, physically, and mentally. Karen's actions had disrupted not just my property but also my peace of mind. I felt anger for the unnecessary chaos she had caused, but I also felt a deep sadness for her. Her breakdown in court had revealed something raw and painful, a woman desperate for validation, clinging to an illusion of control in a life she felt slipping away. It didn't excuse her behavior. But it did make me pause. This experience taught me more than I had expected. I learned to stand my ground, to fight for what I worked so hard to achieve. The cabin wasn't just a piece of property, it was a symbol of my resilience, my sacrifices, and my dreams. Watching Karen try to take that away reminded me of the importance of protecting what you love, even when it feels exhausting or unfair. But it also taught me empathy. Karen's actions came from a place of pain and insecurity, not pure malice. As much as I wanted to hate her, I couldn't ignore the humanity in her desperation. It was a stark reminder that sometimes, people lash out not because they're inherently bad, but because they don't know how else to cope. As I leaned back in my chair, the familiar sound of loons echoed across the lake. Stars dotted the sky like tiny diamonds, their light reflected in the still water. For the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of calm settle over me. The cabin was more than just walls and a roof, it was a piece of my soul, a reminder of everything I had worked for. Raising my cup to the night sky, I whispered to myself, here's to standing strong. To healing. And to finding peace again. Life throws challenges at us in ways we can't always predict. It's easy to give up or let anger consume us, but sometimes the hardest fights are the most important ones. Have you ever had to fight for something you hold dear? How did it shape you? Share your story below. I'd love to hear how you found your strength and reclaimed your peace. As the weeks passed, life at the cabin began to settle into its familiar rhythm. The chaos that Karen had brought into my world was now just a memory, one that still stung but also reminded me of the strength I found within myself. The repairs to the cabin were finished, and everything had been restored to the tranquil sanctuary I had always loved. But in many ways, I felt different, stronger, more grounded, and deeply appreciative of what I had. One evening, as the sun dipped below the mountains and painted the lake in hues of gold and amber, I sat on the porch and reflected on everything that had happened. It wasn't just about a cabin or a property dispute. It was about standing firm in the face of injustice, about valuing the things that truly matter, and about understanding that even in conflict, there are lessons to be learned. Karen had tried to take something precious from me, but in doing so, she gave me an unexpected gift, clarity. I saw my resilience tested and proved that I could weather storms, both literal and metaphorical. I also learned that even in the most infuriating people, there is often a deeper story, a pain or fear driving their actions. While her methods were inexcusable, her breakdown in court revealed a side of her that was deeply human. It didn't erase the damage she caused, but it helped me release some of the anger I carried. As I watched the first stars appear in the sky, I raised a glass to my little slice of paradise. Life wasn't perfect, but it was mine, and I wouldn't trade that for anything. Life often challenges us in ways we least expect. Sometimes, it's a dispute with a neighbor, other times, it's standing up for something you believe in. Have you ever faced a situation where you had to fight for your home, your peace, or your dreams? How did you handle it, and what did it teach you? Or maybe you've had your own Karen moment, a time when someone's actions turned your world upside down. Did you come out stronger, or did it leave you with a story you'll never forget? I'd love to hear your experiences. Share them in the comments below. Let's connect through the wild, unpredictable journeys that make us who we are.